Home Studio Start podcast.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to the first ever deep dive from the Home Studio Start podcast. I'm so pumped to finally kick this off. And for our very first deep dive, we're going to be talking about something super important for anyone who's starting out with their home studio or is just really into how good music can sound. Today, we're going to dive deep into balancing track levels in audio mixing. We found some really interesting stuff that explains why some mixes sound kind of messy while others are super clear and punchy. Think about your favorite songs like those where you can hear each instrument and the vocals perfectly. That's the magic behind balancing the levels, and we're going to break it down for you today. Our mission today is to give you, the listener, the essential knowledge to start making your own amazing music. We'll be looking into managing frequencies, volume automation panning, balancing multi-track recordings, and even how to use creative effects to your advantage. Are you ready to get started? Let's start by talking about the frequency spectrum. Have you ever noticed how a mix can sometimes just feel too crowded? One source compared a mix to a jigsaw puzzle, and the different frequencies are like the puzzle pieces.
If you try to force too many pieces into the same spot, it gets messy.
Exactly. It's like when the bass line and the kick drum blend together or the vocals get lost behind a wall of guitars. Why is understanding frequencies so important? Well, every instrument kind of has its own spot when it comes to frequency range. The really low sounds like your kick drum and bass are usually between 20 and 250 hertz. Vocals and guitars tend to be in the mid-range, somewhere between 250 and 4,000 hertz. And then there's the really bright stuff like the hi-hats and cymbals. Those are up in the higher frequencies from 4,000 all the way to 20,000 hertz. Knowing these general zones is the first step in making your mix clear. So it's not just about keeping everything within those boxes right. I mean, I've definitely heard bass guitars that have a punchy high-end sound too. You're totally right. Sometimes the edges of those ranges can clash. For instance, if your bass guitar has a lot of harmonics around 250, 300 hertz, it might clash with the lower frequencies of your rhythm guitars. That's where using EQ in those overlapping areas becomes super important. What are some practical ways to solve this frequency puzzle?
One technique that really stood out is subtractive EQ. Think of your mix like a sculpture hidden inside a block of sound. Subtractive EQ is like a chisel you use to remove extra noise and clashing frequencies instead of just adding more sound on top. For example, if your kick and bass are both really loud in the same low frequencies, try lowering some of the less important frequencies from one of them. I really like that analogy. It's about creating space by taking away what you don't need. My DAW has a spectrum analyzer. How can that be helpful? A spectrum analyzer is like a visual EQ curve. It shows you how strong different frequencies are in your audio signal. You can literally see where the energy is concentrated and where there might be clashes. It's really useful for spotting if your bass and kick drum are both peaking at the same low frequency. So you can actually see where the sound is getting cluttered. That makes sense. Another trick for separating sounds is panning right. Placing things to the left and right in the stereo image. Absolutely. Panning is like giving each instrument its own space on a stage.
By positioning different sounds across the stereo field, left, right, or center, you create more separation and prevent those frequency pileups. It gives each sound its own place to shine and can really open up your mix. So the core elements like bass and lead vocals usually go in the middle. That's usually the strongest anchor for your mix. But then you can start to spread out other elements. For example, you might pan rhythm guitars slightly to the left and right. This not only helps them avoid clashing with the central elements, but also creates a wider, more immersive listening experience. It adds a feeling of space that makes the mix feel more dynamic. What about drums? I've heard different approaches to panning drums. Exactly. In rock or acoustic music, it's common to pan the hi-hats a little to one side and the snare to the other. This can make the drums sound more natural and realistic, almost like you're sitting behind the drummer. In electronic music, you might hear more extreme panning effects, creating sounds that sweep across the stereo field. Cool, so we're creating space in the frequencies and then placing those sounds in the stereo field. What's the next step in getting a balanced mix?
Even with great frequency management and panning, you might have instruments or vocals that go from very quiet to very loud. That's where volume automation comes in. It's not just about fixing levels, it's like conducting an orchestra, guiding the listener's attention and shaping how the song feels. So instead of just setting one volume level for a vocal track, you can actually adjust it throughout the song. Exactly. If a singer whispers a line and then belts out the chorus, automation lets you keep their performance consistent in the mix without squashing everything with heavy compression. You can really fine-tune those moments that need to stand out or be a bit quieter. How can I start using automation in my own projects? The key is to really listen to your tracks and identify those moments that need a little boost or reduction. Maybe the backing vocals are getting lost during a busy chorus, so you can automate a slight volume increase for that section. Or maybe a guitar solo gets a little too loud, so you can gently pull it back. Most DAWs have visual tools, often called volume envelopes, that let you draw these volume changes right on the track. Got it. It's like manually adjusting the volume, but with more precision.
How do compressors and limiters fit into this whole dynamic thing? While automation gives you that precise manual control, compressors and limiters are like your automatic helpers for dynamics. A compressor reduces the difference between the loudest and quietest parts of a sound, making it more consistent. A limiter is like a safety net, preventing the audio signal from getting too loud and causing distortion, those nasty crackling sounds we want to avoid. When we talk about headroom, we mean having enough space and our overall mix is level to avoid those unwanted digital clipping sounds, right? Exactly. So compression is about evening things out and limiting is about preventing overload. How do they work with automation? They often work together. You might use a compressor to smooth out the overall dynamics of a vocal track and then use automation to emphasize specific words or phrases. It's about finding the balance between consistency and nuanced control. We saw that Radiohead's Paranoid Android is a great example of creative automation. What makes the automation in that track so special? That song is a perfect example of how dramatic volume changes can be used to create an artistic effect. It adds to the emotional impact and the journey the song takes you on. It's a great reminder that automation isn't just a technical fix. It can be a really powerful creative tool. Don't be afraid to try it out. Definitely inspiring. Okay, so we've got our frequencies working together, our levels are under control, and we're even using automation creatively. Let's talk about creating that three-dimensional sound with panning and something called stereo imaging. Right. We talked about panning earlier, which is about placing sounds left to right. Stereo imaging takes it a step further by making individual sounds feel wider and deeper. You can do this using special plugins or techniques like mid-side processing. Mid-side processing basically lets you adjust the center and side information of a stereo signal separately. Interesting. So it's not just about left and right, but also about how wide or focused a sound feels.
Yeah.
See that cool? But one source warned against overdoing it with stereo widening. Too much can make your mix sound unnatural thin or even cause some elements to get lost. It's all about finding that sweet spot. How do you know if you've gone too far with the stereo imaging? A good way to test this is to listen to your mix in mono. If elements suddenly disappear or the overall balance changes a lot when you switch to mono, it probably means you've over-widened something. A good mix should still sound balanced, even in mono. That's a great tip, the mono test. How do reverb and delay contribute to creating this sense of space? Reverb and delay are like tools for creating a sense of distance and depth. By adding a bit of reverb to a sound, and maybe panning it slightly, you can make it feel like it's further away in the mix compared to a dry, more centrally placed sound. Think of it like positioning instruments at different distances on a stage. Okay, we've talked a lot about individual tracks. What about when you're working with a full band or a complex production with lots of tracks playing at the same time? How do you balance a multi-track recording? That's where it's important to understand what each instrument does in the arrangement. Like one source said, in most songs, the lead vocals are the focus and nutter. The drums and bass provide the rhythm and low end, and the other instruments add texture and fill out the sound. So you kind of build your mix piece by piece, started with the core elements.
Exactly.
The advice is to start by making the drums and bass sound tight and work well together. Use reference tracks to get a feel for how those core elements sound in professionally mixed music, that clarity and punch without being too loud. And then you add the vocals and make sure they sit well on top of that foundation so the lyrics are clear. Absolutely. A good test is to listen to your mix at a low volume. If you can still hear the vocals clearly, they're probably at a good level. Since the vocals usually carry the main message of the song, they need to be easy to hear. And then you carefully layer in all the other instruments. Yes, and this is where the idea of subtractive mixing really helps. Instead of just turning things up, try lowering the volume of instruments that might be competing for space or making the mix sound cluttered. This gives you more headroom in your mix, reduces the chance of distortion, and makes everything sound cleaner and more balanced. It's about creating a hierarchy where each element has its own role. It sounds like it's a constant process of listening carefully and making small adjustments. Definitely. And don't forget to take breaks.
Stepping away from your mix for a while and coming back with fresh ears can make a huge difference. Okay, so we've talked about frequencies, dynamics, spatial placement, and balancing multi-tracks. Now let's talk about something a little different, using effects to help with balance. I always thought of effects as mainly for adding character or sound design. That's a common way to think about effects, but they can actually be really helpful in getting a well-balanced mix too. Take reverb, for example. You don't need to put it on everything. Using it strategically can create a sense of space that helps different elements fit together better. How does that work? Well, a short, subtle reverb on a lead vocal can make it sound closer and more present in the mix without making it louder.
On the other hand, using a longer reverb on backing vocals or other instruments can push them further back, creating depth and preventing them from competing with the main elements. It's like using space to create separation. That's a really interesting way to think about reverb. What about compression? We talked about it for controlling dynamics, but how can it be used creatively to help with balance? Right, but compression can also be used creatively to create space. Sidechain compression is a perfect example. You could use it to slightly lower the volume of the bass guitar every time the kick drum hits. This ensures that both the kick and the bass have their own space without muddying up the low end. It can create a really nice rhythmic interplay. Another technique is parallel compression, where you mix a heavily compressed version of a track with the original uncompressed version. This can bring out quiet details and add punch without losing the natural dynamics. Interesting. And delay. I usually think of that for cool rhythmic effects. Delay can definitely create rhythmic interest, but it can also help an instrument fit better in the mix without just turning up the volume. For example, a subtle delay on a guitar part can create movement and depth that helps it blend with the drums and bass without overpowering them. It kind of fills in the rhythmic gaps in a natural way. So it's not just about making things sound flashy. It's about using these tools thoughtfully to help all the different parts of your mix work together.
Exactly.
When used with intention effects, can be a powerful tool in achieving a balanced and engaging mix. Wow, this has been such a helpful deep dive into something that can be confusing when you're starting out. To recap some of the key things we've learned, we explored the frequency spectrum and why it's important to give each instrument its own space. We talked about how volume automation and dynamic control with compression and limiting are essential for maintaining consistent levels and adding life to your mix. We learned about how panning and stereo imaging can create width and depth, making your mix sound more immersive and interesting. And we discussed balancing multi-track recordings, starting with the foundational elements and building from there. Finally, we discovered some really creative ways to use effects like reverb, compression, and delay to create a more balanced and cohesive mix. The main takeaway for me is that balancing levels is both a technical and an artistic skill. It takes practice, patience, and most importantly, trusting your ears. It's really worth it to listen closely to professional tracks you like and try to figure out how they use these techniques.
Absolutely. And remember that sometimes less is more.
Small adjustments can make a big difference in your mix. So for your next project, really focus on these basic techniques and see how they can improve your music. And don't be afraid to experiment. Every song is different, and finding the right balance is a big part of the creative process. Well said. Hopefully you now have a better understanding of how to balance track levels in your own home studio. We talked about managing the frequency spectrum, the power of automation and dynamic control, how to create space, with panning the importance of core elements in multi-track recordings, and even how to use creative effects to get that perfect balance. We really encourage you to take these ideas and try them out in your own music. Listen to your favorite songs and see if you can hear how they use these techniques to create that clear and powerful sound. And if you have more questions or specific mixing problems you're struggling with, let us know. We're always looking for ideas for future deep dives. Thanks so much for joining us for this first deep dive on the Home Studio Start podcast. Until next time, happy mixing.